All right, I wanted to start out by saying I wanted to apologize. Dave, I think, caught the coronavirus, or at least he's sick. I can't confirm or deny that he has corona. I just know that he's not here. So we've replaced him with a very awesome DevOps guy. So Kai, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, Kai Paro. First of all, thank you for having me. Right, I'm very excited to be here. All I want to do is share the things that I've learned, and hopefully it means something to you guys. Right. So I work for Wavefront as a DevOps engineer. Been there for the last 3 years. We were acquired 2 years ago. Before that, I spent 8 years at Robert Half. The last 5 years of that, I was in solutions architecture, and the 3 years before that, I was on the firewall/networking team. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth.
So who are you acquired by again?
VMware.
All right. How's it working for VMware? Is it a big change from Wavefront?
Well, so we've been there for 2 years. We're still very much running like a startup. So we take ownership of everything from the infrastructure to security to code deployments and things like that. So very much still startup, very much still owning our processes.
So when you're talking about taking ownership of it, like what are some of the services that you're really owning, and like what does your infrastructure look like that you're owning?
So yeah, we're leveraging EKS a lot, right? We're delivering Kubernetes environments through EKS. That's the biggest one, right? The Wavefront platform uses like SQS, uses EC2, uses EC2 to manage our database. Our database is on Foundation DB. All that stuff we own, all that stuff we manage.
So, question to the crowd, is anyone here using Kubernetes today? About 25%, maybe 40%, depending on if we have 8 or 12 people who raise their hand. So are you doing production workloads, or is it a production? How long have you been working on that?
Over a year. We came from DCOS, and yeah, big infrastructure setup now on Kubernetes. Using EKS, AKS, ECS, Fargate, and
all variations.
If
right?
it's an acronym, you're using it. So you mentioned EKS.
EKS,
Is
yeah.
that how you're hosting it?
Mm-hmm. And I will say that alone is telling you that the industry wants to move that way. The business wants to move that way. There's a lot of benefits to going that way. The talk that I did recently was about keeping your infrastructure and code.
So hold on one second. Is everyone familiar with EKS?
No.
1, 2, 3. So Kubernetes has a couple options for managed hosting. Amazon has an option called Elastic Kubernetes Service, and then Azure and GCP also have them. So it's AKS and GKE are the other services. There's also OpenShift by IBM. They're all ways where you can host your containers. And Kubernetes is a container orchestration tool, which is in essence a workload hosting platform.
So EKS, I will say, before we started with EKS, we were using COPS. And COPS is very opinionated on how you build your Kubernetes cluster. You give it a set of parameters, and you tell it, I want it in this region, in this account, with these subnets. But it's very opinionated, so it's very hard to extend, right? The other thing that you get friction from is trying to upgrade these clusters. So that's kind of what prompted us to move to EKS. So EKS, they manage the management plane. It's a one-button click to upgrade the cluster. That was the biggest pain point from COPS and what ultimately forced us to move.
So when you migrated to Kubernetes on EKS, were you running into any permission issues or role-based access? How are you managing the security of accessing it?
So access is an interesting story. When we first built the cluster, we built it with my admin permissions, the access and secret keys. When you do that, you paint yourself into a corner because only that key has root to that cluster. So what we found was that when you create the cluster with a role, you can control who can assume that role, and then that spreads your access to the root for that cluster. You can then remove and add people. So like if later on, I move or I get hit by a bus, company's not screwed, right? So that was important.
So what are you using to create these users, or how do you manage it? I assume it has to be centrally managed, otherwise, like, someone leaves the company, they still have accounts that exist, and that's generally a problem.
Yeah, so it's important to distinguish that what I'm talking about is infrastructure admin access to these clusters. So these are the guys that are going to be spinning up clusters, that are going to be making changes to the infrastructure. There's a whole different process for getting developers access to the clusters, and that's an interesting story on its own. We manage the infrastructure access through Terraform, and because this access is gated on a condition list on the role, I can say this IAM user can access. If you're not a part of this list, then you can't access. So that's how that's managed.
So you were talking about giving a talk at reInvent. What was the topic?
It was extreme infrastructure automation, specifically on delivering EKS clusters.
Extreme.
Extreme, yeah, very important there. So to give you a story, we first started messing with EKS last year in June. And I had my first production cluster the next month. Since then, I guess in a matter of 7 months, we're up to 35 clusters.
That was a migration from COPS
Yes,
to,
correct.
okay. And you migrated to this, and how are you managing? Like 35 is a lot of clusters.
What's important is that when we started off on this, we wanted to make sure it was infrastructure as code, and also make sure that I could test my iterations on this infrastructure on a cluster that would not interfere with any workloads, whether that was dev, staging, or prod, right? So when I do that, then I can make sure that my infrastructure change is sound, and I can roll these out to the rest of my clusters. So the other part of that was making sure that each cluster had its own state file. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Terraform, but a state file is like a record of every resource that you define in code. And if each cluster has its own state file, then I can change clusters at will. So I don't not only have incremental change on my infrastructure, my dev cluster, but I can control when I make that change live to the rest of my clusters, dev, stage, and prod. So the name of the game is removing friction and making sure that all of your environments stay the same. And that's really the goal.
So what was the biggest challenge while you were working on deploying infrastructure as code to the level that you're at now?
So there were plenty, actually. This whole thing is kind of a growing code base. What was important to me was that we had a single repo, and this repo would dictate the configuration of all of my environments, regardless of which account they were in and which region they were in. So I wanted to make sure that I passed in minimal parameters to this code base so that I could say, this account, this region, this CIDR, and these people are admins for this cluster, and that's it.
So do you have like approved templates so a new group needs a cluster and you just deploy it very opinionated, or can people define what they want and what they need?
So it's funny that you asked that, because we're actually spread across 4 teams right now. Well, 3 teams. 4 teams. And each team has their own architecture that they want to use for how their cluster should be set up, what should be peered to what, and what account to what region to what. Everyone's got an opinion or how they want their architecture to look. So I had a set of required modules. I have VPC set up this way. I have IAM set up this way. And I have the EKS cluster set up this way. After that, I have optional resources that say this cluster should then be peered to this. And it's important that I'm actually setting up outputs from my VPC cluster so that the optional resources module can pull in parameters from the existing cluster. The whole point is I don't want to look up anything. I don't want to confirm what subnets should be peered. this thing should pull in everything from my existing cluster and peer that way. I don't want to look up anything, right? That's
Yeah.
a point of friction.
So how are you maintaining the files? Are you storing it in GitHub, or what are you doing for the state and for the local configurations?
State is stored in S3. That makes it available to everybody, right? Like if something craps out in a local state, it's not just me that has that state. The state should be in a shared location. S3 allows you also to make sure that it's private and also that it's encrypted. So we use TerraGrunt for that, to manage that, and locking too, to make sure that we're not stepping on people for the state file.
Have you had any challenges with TerraGrunt, or is it a pretty good tool? Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, TerraGrunt is just a wrapper for Terraform. No issues that we've actually seen. Basically, it stores the state file remotely so that when I'm acting against the shared state that everybody else has access to, right?
So as you migrated from COPS to EKS and you moved from a single production cluster to 32 clusters or 35, what's the biggest value you found from it? How has it helped your team, and what is your ultimate goal? Are you done? Is 35 enough?
No, I mean, obviously we've got other teams coming to us asking if we can deliver these clusters, and we've architected it in a way that delivering the clusters is as least friction as possible, because you really need to keep up with the developers, right? Those are the people that are developing features and value and money generating stuff for the company, right? So if you can keep up with them and you are never blocking them, you make sure that value is added as fast as possible.
So I'm seeing a lot of especially coastal companies are migrating to Kubernetes and tools like this, but a lot of like larger enterprises or maybe countries that aren't on the bleeding edge on the West Coast or the East Coast, they're going a little bit slower. And I think one of the challenges they're facing is that when you're in a data center, you have a defined edge. You have also a lot of specialization along teams. Like you have your network team, you have your security team, you have your VMware team, and every team has a lot of experience on doing just that one function. And when you move into the cloud and you adopt tools like Kubernetes, like storage is no longer a separate entity where someone's managing your EMC device. Now it's just something that's attached to your cluster. How do you feel about that, and what are some concerns you've seen, or how does your company address that?
So I will say that moving away or moving towards a cloud presence means that you do lose some specialization from these isolated teams, but the point is that we're increasing communication within the organization, right? So that's super important. Like I said, we did lose some specialization, but that also means that we can leverage the expertise of some of the SaaS vendors that we have, right? Wavefront that I work for is a SaaS vendor. Lacework is a SaaS vendor, so there's expertise there. And so we may not have the chops to fully interpret some of these security issues that come up, but because we have support contracts, we can reach out to someone who is dedicated to this stuff, sees this stuff every day, and we take the input from them, the learnings from them, and we put the fixes in code to make sure that it's, compliant for.
Deploy once, fix everywhere.
Right.
Yeah. So in the cloud, are there any specific security concerns you have that maybe when you were working in the data center you didn't necessarily think about?
The concern with cloud, and I'll say that when I was with Robert Half, when I first started on the networking team, everything was on-prem. So everybody was like, how do we get into the cloud? Everyone's talking cloud. We need a guy to explore. So I made myself available to check out what the cloud thing was doing, and everybody was like, this stuff is publicly accessible. Anybody can get to it on the internet. How do we secure our stuff? And these are fear questions that stop progress, right? Just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean that you stop. IT is very much an environment where you need to push yourself. And the further you push yourself, the more successful you become, much like anything you want to succeed at.
I kind of feel like the inflection point for people migrating to the cloud was 3 or 4 years ago at reInvent. Capital One got up and they spoke with Andy Jassy and they're like, we're all in. We're migrating to the cloud. And at that point, you started to see a lot of other companies say, okay, if a giant credit card and banking is going to move to the cloud, like maybe they figured out security and we can go. Since then, I've seen a lot of customers try, but I also see a lot of customers fail, and it's especially around my environments are too big, too complex, and especially cost-wise, it's calling a lot of people to have concerns and move back. What are you doing to kind of manage cost, and kind of how are you thinking about that?
So everyone's first interaction with the cloud is, dude, my bill is insane, right? And that's because you're trying to explore, you're not sure what these features can do for you, but you also don't know what they cost, right? So everyone gets the sticker shock first. And I think that's just a casualty of war, right? The environment is changing, and you need to figure out how to make the best of your cycles, right? I'll say help me out here.
Yeah, I heard you use Spot Inst. You want to talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
so Spot Inst is interesting because a lot of the friction that we had for our clusters.
Oh, actually, does anyone know what Spot instances are in AWS? Same people who knew Kubernetes.
Yeah.
It's a way to bid on servers. Instead of paying full price, you bid kind of like an auction system, and you only pay the minimum price or the maximum price that anyone's willing to bid. So it really helps you with servers that are preemptible, like they don't have state, or you can just kill them and come back to it later. It really helps you can control cost. And there's a couple products out there like Spot Inst that really help you manage this.
Yeah, I really like Spot Inst because you will find, especially with dealing with Kubernetes clusters, your cluster may run out of resources, and that involves an engineer taking a ticket from a developer saying that they don't have enough resources, so they have to add a cluster to the node. That alone is a friction point, right? If I have a service or a SaaS who is spending their entire budget and their entire developer team on trying to figure out how to make smart decisions on the spot market, I'm going to leverage them. I don't have the time. I don't have, things to do that myself. So we're just removing friction.
So I've talked a little bit about security in the cloud. What sort of programs do you have in place to ensure your infrastructure is secure, and what are you thinking about there?
So SOC 2, right, ISO 2001, 27001, one of those. Yeah, SOC 2 says that we should have quarterly pen tests, so we comply with those. That working with a company that helped us guide through these frameworks raised a lot of holes, right? They should. They're there to identify problems that you have in your infrastructure or your code practices, right? Lacework is interesting because they've got reports that are generated and they run daily, and they tell you on your environment which SOC 2 things you're out of compliance with, which ISO things you're out of compliance with, what those controls are meant to satisfy, and how to fix them. So the fact that this stuff runs daily, generates a report, we can send it to management, and that validates this is the right tool, this is how we fix it, let's get these certs, let's get money, right? At the end of the day, that's what we should be doing.
So what was your journey like going for SOC 2 or ISO? I know they're pretty like rough sometimes. Did it take a long time? What was the information gathering like?
It was a pain in the ass. I think everybody knows that, right? Audits are not fun. They schedule time with people from various teams who are subject matter experts on your environment, and they interview them and they say, how are your processes working? This is where you're lacking. This is where you're lacking is the important piece, right? Anywhere that you can fix these, this is where you're lacking points in code, you can get it reviewed, you have an audit trail, right? All of that stuff is gold, and that's really what the interaction is about, right? It sucks, yes. It's necessary, yes.
So it sounds like your infrastructure as code helps that a lot too, because
Incredibly.
you're codified, like, this is the rule, this is how it must
Yeah.
be.
Yeah, not just that, but when they identify these security concerns, it's usually backed by a JIRA ticket, so that starts the paper trail. And then you fix it in code, which also ties back to this JIRA ticket. So you got a paper trail from discovery to closure, which eventually equates to money, right? Like, I don't want to sound like the guy like money's everything, but you're working, right? This is your job. You need to look at these problems in a way that not only satisfies that, but makes your life easier. Like, I'm not about friction.
So, being that you work for Wavefront, but for VMware, how do you interact with their security team? What sort of controls are they requiring, and how do they interact with you?
Sure. So because we were acquired recently, I'll say, 2 years is a long time in IT, but we still operate very much in a startup fashion. We still own our security posture, our infrastructure, all of that. There are some things from corporate IT that says you need to make sure your CloudTrail logs are sent to an S3 bucket so they can consume them and process them through Splunk or whatever their tools are. So that is like an extra buffer. Very rarely do they reach out to us and tell us of something that we don't know about already, because we take the onus to say, this is my product, I need to secure this, right? I need to make sure that we're not exposing anything.
Yeah, that actually ties in. I feel a lot of times that there's two types of companies. The companies that care about security because they have a compliance standard they need to hit, and then there's companies who care about security because they want to be secure. Usually that want to be secure happens because they've been breached sometime and all of a sudden they have money and they've hired someone else, but most of the time it's, I only care about security because I have a compliance standard to meet. I assume you don't feel that way, but what are your thoughts on that?
No, yeah, I mean, putting everything in code kept us in place or at pace with the developers, but also kept us at pace with the security team, with the compliance team, with business objectives, right? As long as we were not the blocker on anything, I'm happy, right? That means developers can say, hey, I have a great idea, I want to experiment with this thing. I'm like, go ahead. We have an environment for you that is production ready from bottom to top, top to bottom. We see everything you do. If you do something bad, we're going to tell you, right? But we're not stopping them from exploring these potential streams of revenue, to be honest.
So Kubernetes has its own entire layer of networking, and every pod can run 1 to 10s to lots of containers. What are you doing for visibility? How are you managing that? And like, how are you making sure, say, a developer is not deploying insecure or bad containers?
I can tell you in the past, it sucked. That stuff is a black box, and unless you instrument your security tools successfully, you're going to have a very hard time trying to track down what a Kubernetes cluster is doing. With Lacework in play, because every container host stands up with a Lacework agent, we can see everything. And that's the containers that are running, what they're talking to, on which port, when it happened, who it came from, and where is it going. We have visibility into everything. And so we rely heavily on, we've got a Slack integration and we've got a JIRA integration. Basically, anytime a security event happens from Lacework, it'll create a JIRA ticket, but it'll also spit out the event data into Slack. So, I've got my notifications on Slack saying, hey, something's wrong, you should look. I look, is it expected? Cool. If not, then I'm chasing the shit down. You know what I mean?
So what does the average day look like for you from a DevOps perspective and then from a security perspective?
Yeah. A lot can happen in 3 years. As I said, when I first started, we were only focused on the Wavefront platform, and that is all EC2 and other AWS services, like I mentioned before, SQS and SNS and IAM and stuff. There was an exploratory effort to get into Kubernetes. that eventually led us to 35 clusters across 4 accounts in 5 different regions. Everything is in code. Even peering from one account to another, from one VPC to another, is codified in a way that I don't have to look anything up. The whole process was about removing friction. So my day is really about focusing on what are my next architectural things I want to add, what are the next features I want to add, what is the next friction I want to remove, right? That's where you want to be. You want to be in a place where you're spending your cycles and your time on things that actually are important. No maintenance, right? You don't want to be stuck in this repetition where you're babysitting a queue and someone's like, oh, this port's open on this box. Sucks. Don't do that, right?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a large push towards automation everywhere we go. Honestly, every customer we talk to at Lacework, they're either already automated or they're working towards it. If a company's just starting that train, they're just starting infrastructure as code, they're trying to think about how can we do Kubernetes, is there any advice you'd give them?
Put everything in code from day one.
I mean, that sounds easy, but...
Yeah, I will say that I like Terraform because Terraform will allow you to build resources not just in AWS, but also in GKE and also in Azure. HashiCorp is doing a lot of smart things, right? So use the tools that will make sure that you don't paint yourself into a corner. Don't aim for the super highly available, redundant, thing right out the gate. Make sure that you have your eyes set on what the goal is. Test something that achieves that goal, and then start looking at business goals that whatever you're coding should satisfy. Does it need to be HA? Does it need to be encrypted? Things like that.
Are there any specific tools you would recommend?
Lacework, Wavefront, Terraform, Packer, Ansible.
Right.
The whole suite. Anything that you can put things in code where that you make them visible to other people on your team or other teams is important. Like the DevOps thing was really like, yes, you lose specialization, but you increase communication, right? And that's, I think, paramount to something successful.